So as we look at how literacy approached from a social lens, as I've suggested in previous lectures, to a large extent people embrace the social, but tended to treat it somewhat as a fixed variable, akin to sort of like a context, a setting within which students worked, and didn't really look at it as integrated with literacy. To a large extent, literacy was proceeding in a fashion which some people considered to be like an autonomous model, which was occurring inside the head of the reader, in a fashion that was somewhat mechanistic, and at this point through the 70s, very much influenced by cognitive perspectives. And the social was brought forward as highlighted as influencing a person's literacy learning and how they negotiated literacy. But it was done in a fashion where the social was mediating learning, whereas the social wasn't really considered to be a part of the literacy event or act itself. A famous Russian psychologist in the early part of the 1900s, whose work began to be translated in the 70s and 80s in the Western world, Vygotsky, had emphasized how important the social was, the interactions with others would be in terms of people's development as a learner. And again, you can sort of see his work sort of perpetuated social interactions with others and so forth as acting in a sort of a social mediated sort of fashion. Interesting, as people's focus on cognition deepened, some people suggested that perhaps we should sort of look at how cognition acts in the real world. And this led to a number of people discussing the concept of situated cognition. How does cognition actually work in the hands of experts or everyday life, and how might that influence how we deal with things in schools? One of the important articles was by a number of cognitive psychologists of the time, John Seely Brown, Al Collins, and Dugard, in an article on situated cognition, where they advocated situation cognition, where they engaged in a very interesting comparison as a basis for unpacking what a justification for situated cognition. They compared the reasoning, the problem solving that different groups did. A group they called just plain folks, I should reverse that, GPF. Students, people in schools, and practitioners, those people who engaged in activities as part of their profession. And so they looked at, well, how do they engage in the reasoning? How do they act upon things? How do they resolve them? And what's produced? And you can sort of see, for at least the two groups, that they're very similar. Just plain folks and practitioners reason with stories and narratives and how they've solved problems before, what they call causal stories, that is very much tied to the situation and analyses of the situation of what's gone before, what's actually occurring. For the professional, it might be done conceptually. That oftentimes the problem is one that's sort of emerging, or it might be ill-defined, not really fixed as one might sort of sometimes see a problem defined, and how the problem is resolved in a fashion that's negotiated, tied to the situation, but very much involved in a social negotiation. They compared this with their view of schools, where oftentimes students are presented with not so much causal stories, but laws, or algorithms almost to solve problems. And oftentimes, and certainly in abstract mathematics they're dealing with this, in geometry and some other ways, they're dealing with symbols or representations of real-world problems, but things which may be a far cry from the reality. In the reading situation, they might be reading about something or other, but not really involved in the real-world problem, where the text is an integrated part of an issue in the real world. And in terms of the nature of the problem itself, in schools it's typically oftentimes well-defined, realizing this is sort of a general characterization. And there is a sort of a notion of accuracy where there is a fixed solution to a problem. Their argument was that if we start to sort of shift education to situated cognition, we not only change it to real-world problems, but we change it to a form of apprenticeship, where the learning itself and the problem solving is also negotiated in situations and socially negotiated. In one sense, this work was a precursor, I think, to actually making the social turn, but it still was very much tied to an inside the head, a relatively mechanistic notion of learning, and where the social acts as a mediator. And literacy isn't being viewed as involving social dynamics. Literacy is being viewed as being supported by the social. The social is part of the context and might act in a mediating role. This work preceded, however, some very important work which shifted from a socio-cognitive approach to a socio-cultural view, which really did lead to what I view as a very significant turn in how we came to look at literacy processes, not so much as inside the head, but very much governed by outside the head dynamics, literacy events and practices which are occurring socially in situation began to be perceived as part of what's involved in, not part of, but what is involved in literacy.